So, it's been a minute, but we are back to finish what we started, and that is to analyze all the major characters in Your Turn to Die. After a not-so-subtle poll, you guys voted for Tia Safalin, or Tia Safalin if we're going by VG person lore, but for the sake of my declining psyche, I'm just gonna call her Safalin. We cool? As with the previous videos, I'm always surprised with how much I'm able to learn after my second, third, or 15th playthrough of the game. And yet there's still so much more I've yet to discover, but enough babbling, let's find out what the deal is with Melon Soda Lady. Safalin's introduced in Chapter 2, alongside Rio Ranger as the Vice Floor Master. I always found it funny that Rio was like, "You're real cute, so move it already," but then when you see her, it's like, "Oh, Jesus!" Yeah, you're right. Out of all the Floor Masters we've seen, including Midori, I think Safalin's the most interesting of the bunch. She's a side character who didn't feel like a side character. It always felt as though she knew more than what she let on, that she played a much bigger role than what we've seen thus far. She keeps making the player flip-flop between, okay, she's kind of on our side, but she isn't until she is, kind of. But I think that's due in part with how she was made to be. At her core, Safalin's very caring to a very distressing degree. She definitely supported everyone more than the other Floor Masters, but she made it clear that she was still their enemy. As ManlyBadassHero would put it, it's as if she was programmed with certain extremes of positive emotions, causing her to feel a bit too much, compared to Ranger, who didn't have any positive emotions at all. That probably explains why she's called the crying doll and why she's crying all the time. It's the ultimate form of momming to a point where it becomes twisted. The memory erasing machine thing, for example, is something she believes to be a way to achieve happiness. She encouraged Sarah, Reiko, and Alice to use it, to which Sarah is the only one to use it multiple times. But that's only if the player decides to do so, you sadistic bastard. We see Safalin use words like salvation and regret because she knows that she's been dealing with hallucinations of Joe. She does warn Sarah of the dangers of using it multiple times, but she doesn't actively try to stop her. Instead, we see Safalin ecstatic that she was able to break Sarah entirely, giving her a new toy to play with in a sense. I'm going to go out on a whim here and say that this machine, in a way, makes others become like Safalin, given that it leaves nothing but the positive emotions at the cost of, well, everything else. And her comment of, "What a cheerful face," as Sarah has the same expression as Safalin. She cares for others so much that she's willing to break them in order to keep them for herself. We also learn where the dolls from Chapter 1 were being stored. She tells Sarah that she isn't the one who makes the dolls, she just keeps custody of them. But as we'll see later on, she is tasked by Midori to perform maintenance on the AI Seaver, meaning she does have knowledge on how these dolls were made, including Rio Ranger. During Ranger's creation, Safalin was in charge of his positive emotions while Gashu handled the negative ones. However, Gashu stopped her as he believed imperfection is what makes a real human. It's very possible that Safalin felt guilty for not completing Ranger, and so she finished what she started when Ranger was on the brink of death. The way she describes the circumstances surrounding his creation and questions him on how much he really knows about himself, it really makes you wonder who was actually the Vice Floor Master. It also puts into perspective on how insignificant Ranger's whole existence really was. He was never Gashu's prized creation, and Safalin knew this, but chose not to say anything. Once Ranger dies, she once again helps the candidates by giving them Ranger's chip. Alright, so this is gonna sound strange, but hear me out for a sec. This pose that Safalin makes low-key sums up her character. For the most part, Safalin's been pushed around by pretty much everyone, and so she isn't made out to be a threat, especially since she was overshadowed by Ranger. As I said earlier, she makes it clear that she is their enemy, and that she's only helping the candidates because that was her duty. Whether it was out of desperation or how everyone had perceived her out to be, everyone thought Safalin would help them after Gashu had killed himself, but that couldn't be further from the truth. As much as she would have liked to help, there was only so much she could do or else everyone would die. It's this dichotomy and the way she misleads you with her behavior that makes Safalin such an interesting character. The only other character I can compare her to is Maple. Both don't necessarily lean towards one end of the spectrum. Characters like Ranger and Miley are clearly shown to be the bad guys, as they couldn't care less about the candidates and just wanted to see them struggle and suffer. Safalin and Maple, on the other hand, act as support but won't provide any more than what is needed. I guess you could argue that they both helped a bit too much, but we take what we can get. One last thing I'd like to bring up is this document found in Chapter 3, where we learn that Safalin's true identity is that of Michiru Namida, a researcher who was treated poorly at her former workplace. Namida, along with Emery Harai, were two people who met Gashu's requirements, and so they joined Asunaro, where Namida was promised an ideal work environment. I'd say the death game was more than ideal, especially given the one bad ending. But this information does raise the question of whether or not Safalin was a doll. Dolls don't bleed. We've seen this when Ranger was shot by Gashu. But if you recall, Safalin cut her own hand to prove that one of her treatments was harmless. Her hand began to bleed, but this detail was brushed off rather quickly. With that said, we know Safalin isn't a doll, but does that mean she's still human? Did she undergo some weird experiments on herself, or was Asunaro responsible for altering her appearance and emotions? If that's the case, then what's their obsession with food, and why was she dressed up as a melon soda? All important questions that'll hopefully be answered in the final chapter. Like, comment, subscribe.